Justice Sotomayor stopped the room cold by challenging Jasmine Crockett's credibility point blank. And when Crockett fired back with a razor-sharp rebuttal about real lives being decided from the bench, the audience erupted as a civil panel instantly spiraled into a tense, edge-of-your-seat showdown over who gets to define justice in America. The Georgetown Law Center Auditorium didn't feel like a classroom that night. It felt like a courtroom with better lighting. More than 500 people packed in. Law students squeezed shoulder to shoulder, professors lined up along the walls. Justice Sonia Sotomayor sat with the steady composure of someone who had spent years deciding outcomes that changed lives, her posture saying she didn't need theatrics to command the room. Across from her, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat upright, eyes sharp, jaw set, the posture of someone who didn't come to admire institutions. She came to challenge them. And when Crockett adjusted her mic, the air shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but unmistakably. Like the room knew the polite phase was over. Crockett didn't ease into her answer. She drove straight through it. She said the court wasn't just interpreting law anymore. It was shaping reality while pretending to stand above politics, and that pretense, in her words, was the most dangerous fiction in modern government. The crowd reacted instantly. Some clapped, some stiffened. Because she wasn't criticizing decisions. She was questioning motives. She leaned forward and added, sharper this time, that when unelected judges overturn policies affecting millions, calling it neutrality feels less like principle and more like insulation from consequences. You can't hide behind robes and call it objectivity, she said, voice steady but cutting. If your rulings change who gets to vote, who gets to study, who gets to control their own body, that's not theory, that's power. The applause came harder this time, mixed with uneasy murmurs, because the accusation wasn't subtle. She went further, saying Congress wasn't attacking the judiciary by talking reform. It was doing oversight, something the Constitution never intended to be optional. If an institution can't be questioned, she added, it stops being accountable and starts acting untouchable. Sotomayor didn't interrupt. She watched Crockett the way a trial judge watches an attorney walk too close to a line. When the applause crested, she leaned forward, a small motion that hit the room like a gavel. Conversations died mid-whisper. She spoke, calm but edged with steel. Representative, strong language doesn't become stronger because it's loud. The audience froze. She continued, voice measured but unmistakably firm, saying that calling the court a political weapon risks teaching the public to see every ruling as conspiracy instead of law. When leaders describe disagreement as corruption, she added, eyes locked on Crockett, they aren't exposing power. They're eroding trust. The words weren't shouted, but they landed heavy, like an indictment wrapped in courtesy. Crockett didn't look away. She held the stare, chin lifted, expression daring the challenge. The moderator glanced between them, clearly realizing the panel had crossed into something raw and unscripted. And when she finally asked, almost cautiously, Justice Sotomayor, would you like to respond directly? The room fell into a silence so tight it felt physical. Justice Sotomayor didn't jump in. She claimed the moment. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone aware they were standing on a fault line. When she spoke, her tone was controlled, almost warm, the kind of warmth that makes you lean in before you realize it's a setup. She said she respected Crockett's passion, her legal background, and the fire she brought to the conversation. A few people relaxed, thinking this was a de-escalation. Then Sotomayor added calmly but with unmistakable edge, but passion doesn't excuse precision. And words matter when you're speaking about an institution that millions depend on. The room tightened. She wasn't scolding. She was repositioning the battlefield. When you label the court a political weapon, she continued, eyes fixed on Crockett, you're not just criticizing outcomes. You're telling the public the system itself is corrupt. That's not rhetoric. That's an accusation. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Crockett didn't flinch, but her shoulders squared like a fighter settling into stance. Sotomayor's voice never rose, but the implication did. You don't get to throw grenades and call it debate. Then she delivered the strike. She leaned forward just enough to make the movement feel intentional, surgical. So, let me ask you directly, she said. When you accuse the court of acting as a political weapon, did you actually read the full opinions? The words didn't explode. They sliced. A collective gasp cut through the auditorium, followed by sharp whispers that spread like sparks. This wasn't policy disagreement anymore. This was a credibility challenge, issued on a stage full of people who understood exactly how brutal that question was. A few students actually mouthed "wow" without sound. Sotomayor held eye contact, unblinking. Because criticizing a ruling without engaging the text, she added, voice steady, isn't oversight. It's performance. The air changed instantly. Crockett's jaw tightened, not in surprise but in calculation. The accusation wasn't subtle. She was being asked, in front of future lawyers and professors, whether her outrage was informed or theatrical. The silence that followed felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for the recoil. Before Crockett could fire back, the moderator stepped in, voice careful but shaky, reminding the audience that Georgetown had provided a briefing packet. Excerpts, summaries, annotations, so the debate could stay anchored in actual language, not headlines. The mention landed differently now. Every eye flicked to the folders on the table. Sotomayor gave a slight nod toward them, almost polite, almost lethal. Exactly, she said. If we're going to dismantle the court in public, we should at least start with what the court actually wrote. A few students let out nervous laughs, the kind that happens when tension crosses into spectacle. Crockett's eyes dropped to the packet, then snapped back up. Crockett didn't rush her reply. She let the weight of Sotomayor's question hang there for a beat, eyes steady, fingers still resting on the briefing packet like she was grounding herself in the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not defensive, not rattled, just precise. Yes, she said. I read them. I'm an attorney. No speech, no resume recital, just a clean statement that landed with quiet force. She lifted the packet slightly. I don't criticize rulings from headlines. I criticize them from the text, because the text is where the consequences live. A few heads nodded in the crowd. The tension didn't disappear. It shifted. Crockett wasn't dodging the credibility challenge. She was stepping directly into it. Her gaze never left Sotomayor. The problem, she added evenly, is that legal reasoning doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands somewhere. It lands on people. You could feel the audience lean forward again. This wasn't about winning a point. It was about reframing the battlefield. Her tone sharpened as she continued, and now every example came out like evidence being entered into the record. She talked about voting access, communities forced to navigate rules that look neutral on paper but feel like locked doors in practice. She talked about affirmative action, students watching opportunities disappear while being told the system is simply correcting itself. She talked about workers whose protections erode in rulings written in language most families will never read, and women whose bodily autonomy becomes a constitutional abstraction decided far from their daily reality. Each point hit harder than the last, not louder, just heavier. We keep talking about institutional legitimacy, Crockett said, voice tightening with controlled frustration. But legitimacy means very little to someone explaining to their daughter why her options just got smaller. To them, this isn't doctrine. It's damage. The room reacted in waves, some applause, some stiff silence. Crockett pressed forward. You call it neutral interpretation. They call it a door closing. The words didn't feel rehearsed. They felt lived in. Then she broke eye contact with Sotomayor and turned to the audience. The shift was deliberate, widening the circle of accountability. She gestured toward the students packed into the rows. You're the next clerks, the next litigators, she said. You're the ones who will sit across from families and explain what these rulings mean in plain English. Her voice softened, but the edge remained. So, let me ask you something. The auditorium went still. Who here has had to tell a client that a perfectly legal decision, a neutral one, still hurt them? For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then a hand rose. Then another. Not many, but enough. The sight changed the temperature instantly. It wasn't theory anymore. It was testimony without words. Crockett nodded once, acknowledging them. "That's what I'm talking about," she said quietly. "Law doesn't just live in opinions. It lives in consequences." Applause erupted from one side of the room while the other side stayed seated, arms folded, expressions tight. Justice Sotomayor let the applause settle before she spoke, her posture straightening with the quiet certainty of someone drawing a boundary she had no intention of stepping back from. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, the kind of tone that makes people stop mid-whisper. "Representative," she began, eyes steady, "the moment outcomes start dictating interpretation, the rule of law stops being law. It becomes preference." The room went still again. She didn't rush the words. She placed them carefully, like evidence on a table. Courts are not designed to deliver popular results. They're designed to apply principles consistently, even when those principles frustrate us. A few students shifted in their seats. Sotomayor continued, calm but unmistakably firm. "If judges start deciding cases based on what feels fair in the moment, we don't have constitutional interpretation anymore. We have politics wearing a robe." The phrasing landed hard. It wasn't theatrical. It was clinical, and that made it sting more. Crockett watched without blinking, arms still, expression unreadable, but the tension between them was now visible to everyone. Sotomayor pivoted without raising her voice. "And when the response to disagreement is to restructure the court," she said, "we are no longer debating law. We are debating control." Her gaze sharpened. "If you change the size or rules of the court every time a ruling offends the majority, you're not correcting injustice. You're signaling that judicial independence is conditional." A murmur rippled through the audience. She pressed the point with surgical calm. "Today you expand the court because you dislike its decisions. Tomorrow the other side does the same. And then again. Where does it end?" She let the question hang, heavy and deliberate. "That path doesn't stabilize democracy. It turns the judiciary into a political scoreboard. And once courts are seen as extensions of temporary power, their authority collapses." The room felt tighter, like everyone understood she wasn't exaggerating. She was mapping a chain reaction. Crockett's jaw flexed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Sotomayor's tone remained steady, but the warning inside it was unmistakable. This wasn't about ideology. It was about whether the system survives its own temptations. Then Sotomayor made her move. She glanced down at the briefing packet, tapped it once with her finger, and looked back up. "So let's ground this in specifics," she said. "You've referenced several opinions tonight. Name one, just one, concrete legal flaw in the reasoning. Not the outcome, the reasoning." A few audible breaths caught in the crowd. This wasn't a rhetorical jab. It was a precision demand. "If the court is acting as a political weapon," she added, voice cool, "show us exactly where the law was abandoned." The implication was razor sharp. Broad moral arguments wouldn't pass this test. Crockett could feel the trap. Go wide, and it sounds like rhetoric. Go narrow, and the emotional force risks shrinking to technical detail. She didn't speak right away. She reached down slowly, flipped open her packet to a marked page, and lifted her eyes back to Sotomayor. When she looked up, her voice was steady, not louder, just more direct. "You want specifics?" she said. "Fine, let's talk about the framework everyone keeps telling communities to trust." She tapped the packet once. "This system, the one we're told to protect at all costs, was designed by men who owned slaves. Men who built a government that didn't even recognize people who look like me as full citizens. The air snapped tight. A sharp gasp rolled through the auditorium, and several professors exchanged glances like they'd just felt history shove its way into the room. Crockett didn't soften it. So when I hear respect the founder's intent, what I hear is worship at the altar of a blueprint that never included us. The words hung heavy. Some students nodded fiercely, others stiffened. This wasn't academic critique anymore. It was a challenge to the moral foundation of the argument itself. Crockett's eyes stayed locked on Sotomayor. You're asking people harmed by that design to keep faith with it. That's not neutrality. That's endurance. Then she lowered her gaze to the packet and read. Paraphrasing instead of reciting, she described how the doctrine in question, framed as neutral interpretation, strips away a protection while insisting it's simply applying principle. Look at the logic, she said, tapping the page again. It narrows a safeguard, predicts who will be affected, and still calls the outcome incidental. She lifted her head. That's not a neutral machine. It outputs consequences. And those consequences aren't random. Her tone sharpened, not angry, but surgical. When a doctrine consistently lands hardest on the same communities, we don't get to pretend that pattern is invisible just because the language is clean. A murmur spread through the crowd. Crockett pushed one step further. You can dress it in constitutional reasoning, but if the result is predictable harm, the public is going to read that as intent, whether the court likes that or not. Applause erupted from one side of the room, while the other side sat rigid, arms folded, absorbing the accusation. The split reaction didn't slow her. People don't experience doctrine, she said quietly. They experience impact. Sotomayor let the noise settle before answering, her expression composed but unmistakably personal now. Representative, she said, voice calm. I don't deny the Constitution's original sins. My own life is shaped by them. She spoke about growing up in poverty, about navigating systems that weren't built with her in mind. But the same framework you're criticizing, she continued, is what allowed generations to force change, to expand rights, to correct injustice, to open doors that were welded shut. She wasn't dismissing Crockett's critique. She was reframing it. The Constitution is imperfect, she said, but it's also the mechanism through which imperfection has been challenged. The room held still, caught between two truths spoken from lived experience. Crockett didn't ease back after the founder's argument. She leaned into the next strike like momentum itself was part of her case. She straightened, eyes locked on Sotomayor, and said what half the room already felt building. Let's talk about the numbers, she said. 6-3, a pattern so consistent it doesn't look like coincidence. It looks like confession. The phrase hit like a match in dry air. Murmurs rippled immediately. Crockett didn't pause. When the same block of justices repeatedly delivers outcomes that align with one political philosophy, she continued, the public doesn't experience that as abstract jurisprudence. They experience it as governance. Her voice sharpened. An unelected body-shaping policy with lifetime appointments. That's not just interpretation anymore. That's a super legislature. A few students clapped hard. Others shook their heads. Crockett pressed the point, tone steady but cutting. You can call it doctrine all day, but when the impact mirrors party priorities, people stop believing they're watching neutral arbitration. They see power without a ballot attached to it. The division in the room was immediate and loud, applause colliding with stiff silence. And Crockett let it sit, like she'd just put a fact on trial and was waiting for the jury to feel uncomfortable. Sotomayor answered without raising her voice, but the calm in it felt deliberate. A counterweight to Crockett's heat. Patterns, she said evenly, do not equal partisanship. She leaned forward just slightly, tone precise. You're conflating judicial philosophy with party loyalty, and that distinction is not cosmetic. It's foundational. The audience quieted. Originalism, textualism, living constitutionalism. These are interpretive frameworks, she continued. They shape how a justice reads the law, not who they're trying to help politically. Her gaze held Crockett's. A ruling aligning with a party's goals does not mean it was written for that party. Law is not a scoreboard. The words landed clean. If we reduce jurisprudence to partisan math, she added, we teach the public to distrust every decision they dislike, and that erosion doesn't stop at one ideology. It eats the entire institution. The room absorbed it in silence. Some faces softened, others tightened. Sotomayor's message was clear. Disagreement is inevitable, but collapsing philosophy into politics rewrites how justice is perceived. Sensing the exchange was spiraling toward abstraction, the moderator stepped in with a voice that cut through the tension. "Let me try something direct," she said. "Both of you, name one reform you could support that doesn't weaponize outcomes." The room perked up instantly. This wasn't theory anymore. It was a pressure test. Sotomayor answered first. "Enforceable ethics standards," she said without hesitation. "Transparency that strengthens trust without dictating results." A few approving nods moved through the audience. Crockett followed immediately. "Ethics enforcement," she agreed, "but with real accountability, not symbolic oversight." Then she pivoted, eyes steady. "And structural accountability still has to be on the table. Ethics alone doesn't fix imbalance." The moderator didn't interrupt. Crockett leaned toward the mic again, eyes sweeping the audience once before locking back on Sotomayor. "I hear everything you're saying about patience and process," she began, voice steady but charged. "But I cannot, and I will not, tell my constituents to wait for justice." The sentence landed like a gavel. A ripple of sound moved through the auditorium before applause broke out, loud and immediate. Crockett kept going, stacking her examples with surgical pacing. She spoke about a young voter turned away by rules that feel procedural on paper but personal in practice. Then, a student watching an opportunity disappear, told it was simply an interpretation of fairness. Then, a worker explaining to their child why protections vanished in language nobody at their kitchen table understands. Each example came faster, tighter, more emotional than the last. "To them," Crockett said, voice firm, "justice delayed isn't theory. It's damage." The applause split the room again. Cheers on one side, tight silence on the other, and the tension felt like it could tip either way. Before the reaction settled, a voice from the front rows cut in. The moderator, sensing the boil-over, nodded toward a student already halfway to their feet. The student spoke quickly, nervous but clear. "My friend is already cutting a clip of this," they said, holding up a phone. "Half the internet is only going to see 12 seconds of what just happened." Nervous laughter rippled across the room, then died just as fast. The implication sank in. Everyone suddenly pictured the moment fractured into sound bites, stripped of context, weaponized by whoever posted first. Crockett glanced at the raised phone, then back at Sotomayor, and for a beat, neither woman spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reflective, heavy with the realization that the debate wasn't just happening in the room. It was already escaping it. The audience shifted, some lowering their own phones, as if aware they were participating in the distortion they'd just heard described. Sotomayor broke the quiet with a tone that was calm but unmistakably warning. She looked straight toward the cluster of glowing screens. "Once you open that door," she said, "you won't close it." Her voice carried without force. "When complex legal arguments are reduced to 12 seconds, we don't just lose nuance. We lose trust." She turned slightly back toward Crockett, not confrontational, just firm. Courts cannot function as majoritarian weapons. The moment decisions become viral contests, the rule of law becomes performance. The words settled over the room like a caution sign no one could ignore. You could feel the audience recalibrating. The heat of the clash now mixed with a sudden awareness of how fragile the narrative was outside those walls. The moderator stepped in again, voice steady but energized. "We're going to take one final audience question," she announced. A few hands shot up instantly, but one student was already standing, notes in hand, expression focused. The student who stood didn't look nervous. They looked surgical, the kind of calm that comes from someone used to thinking in briefs instead of speeches. Notes in hand, voice steady, they cut straight through the tension. "If both of you are right about different dangers," the student said, eyes moving between Crockett and Sotomayor, "harm now versus chaos later, what do you owe the next generation tomorrow morning?" The room went still in a way that felt different from every silence before it. This wasn't applause silence or shock silence. It was recognition. The question stripped away slogans and forced the debate into something practical and immediate. You could feel the audience lean in because suddenly this wasn't about theory or ideology. It was about consequence on a clock. Crockett's jaw tightened slightly. Sotomayor's posture straightened. Neither woman spoke right away. The pause itself was part of the answer. This was the moment where rhetoric had to turn into responsibility. Sotomayor answered first, voice quieter than before but carrying more weight because of it. She admitted, plainly, that institutions can be exploited. History proves that. But she said the greater danger comes when guardrails disappear entirely. "When rules collapse," she said, "the first people hurt are not the powerful. It's minorities. It's dissenters. It's the people with the least protection." Her gaze swept the audience. "Tomorrow morning, what I owe the next generation is a system strong enough to survive anger, fear, and political swings, because instability never lands evenly." There was no flourish in her delivery, just conviction sharpened by experience. She wasn't defending perfection. She was defending restraint. The message was simple and heavy. A flawed system with guardrails is safer than a system rebuilt in the heat of outrage. Crockett stepped in without hesitation, her tone steady but charged with urgency. "Guardrails that protect injustice aren't neutral," she said. "They're barriers dressed up as stability." She looked directly at the student. "Tomorrow morning, what I owe the next generation is action. Oversight that isn't symbolic, ethics that actually bite, and structural reform when the system stops serving the people it was built to protect." Her voice didn't rise, but the intensity did. "Accountability is not chaos," she added. "It's democracy doing its job." The applause that followed was thunderous and split down the middle, cheers colliding with firm silence. But neither woman reacted to the volume. They held each other's gaze for a brief second, respectful but unyielding. No surrender, no softening. Just two visions standing side by side while the room absorbed the weight of both. The moment the event ended, the debate escaped the auditorium faster than anyone could follow it. Within minutes, two different versions of the night were already circulating. One clip framed Sotomayor as the guardian of institutional sanity, calm, controlled, warning against dismantling the pillars of law. Another clip crowned Crockett as the voice of urgency, refusing delay, demanding reform in language that felt personal and immediate. Both clips were real. Both were incomplete. Online, audiences split instantly, each side convinced they'd witnessed the definitive truth. The same exchange that felt layered and complicated in the room flattened into dueling narratives on screens, and the speed of that transformation was almost dizzying. People weren't arguing over what was said. They were arguing over which slice of it counted. Then Georgetown released the full video, along with references to the briefing materials used during the panel. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. Commentators who had reacted to 12-second fragments started rewatching with context. Some doubled down. Others changed their tone, admitting the longer exchange complicated their first impressions. The receipts were right there. Pacing, build-up, the way each argument answered the other. It didn't erase disagreement. It exposed how easily omission can reshape perception. The real revelation wasn't about who won. It was about how narrative edits can turn a layered confrontation into a claim of total victory. The feed didn't lie outright. It just left out enough to create a different story. By the end of the week, the debate had settled into something more reflective. The question wasn't who landed the hardest line or who drew louder applause. It was what the clash revealed about democracy itself. Crockett embodied urgency, the insistence that justice measured in decades is justice denied to real people right now. Sotomayor embodied restraint, the fear that power without limits burns the very protections it claims to build. Both arguments carried weight because both were rooted in lived stakes. The night wasn't a verdict, it was a mirror, and the image it showed was messy, divided, and undeniably human. One fought for justice on a clock, the other fought for justice to outlive the clock. This wasn't just a debate, it was a collision of ideas about justice, power, and what the future should look like. Moments like this don't end when the cameras stop. They keep unfolding in conversations like the one you're part of right now. Drop your take in the comments. Who made the stronger case, and why? And if you want more breakdowns of the political moments everyone's talking about, hit subscribe and stay with us. The next big clash is already on the horizon.